air pressure there for you, okay?
Excellent. Don't say anything libelous. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Pull it back a little bit. Can there be a 30-second delay type thing to do with live TV? Technical difficulties.
I've got the bleeper ready, James.
Excellent. Great. I'll test you out. Okay, I'll just share my screen and away I go.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. And I was given a time to keep to, and if I don't, I'm sure somebody will push me or sound the buzzer. But here we go. This is my architecture at James Grieve. I'm a chartered architect, and I have been for about 5 or 6 years working in Consort Design Group in the conservation department. And I'm also currently working in the architecture department in Queen's in their stage 1. And I'm the chair of the RSUA's Early Career Architects Forum. First of all, I just want to say that I'm very grateful to be asked to be sharing my experiences of my architecture, and I just want to commend the RSUA for giving the title My Architecture to this presentation, as it's a broad enough term to ensure that each talk is different and interesting for everybody listening, but it's also, I suppose, vague enough that when you're asked to prepare a presentation on it, it gives you a slight sort of existential crisis when you try and figure out what it is that you're doing day to day and why it is that you do it. So this, to me, trying to unravel what my architecture is, has been a little bit of a thought process. I have tried to keep some sort of cohesive and coherent narrative to the following slides, but there is a bit of an ebb and flow throughout this presentation as to what my architecture is. And while this would have been a much easier topic to curate if I had one position in architecture or one element of design which had a constant thread which I could feed through, unfortunately it's not a linear progression, and elements and interests come and go throughout the following slides. But I suppose in using this presentation as an exercise in self-evaluation, it perhaps highlights that a main constant in my career so far has been self-evaluation. Constantly assessing your role within a project, constantly assessing your role within the office, within the construction industry, and constantly assessing and evaluating your position as an architect and how architecture sits at society at large. So yeah, that's my architecture, and for that reason I have titled this talk Learning Through Architecture. And in the following slides I should hopefully be able to touch upon what I've learned throughout my architectural career, sort of external knowledge that I've had to gain, and also what the experiences within my architectural career have taught me. So, learning through architecture. So, start at the start. It's a bit of a common trope that many architects' first interaction with architecture was with Lego or Meccano or some sort of building blocks that they played with as kids, and their progression into architectural education was a clear and intuitive path. For me, that wasn't the case. My first interaction with architecture was probably day 1 of architecture school, where I went to Queen's in Chlorine Gardens. And I mean, looking back on it as to why I decided to study architecture, but still don't really know what the reason behind it was. I had no real preconceived notions as to what lay ahead of me. Maybe designing skyscrapers and iconic international landmarks. And to be honest, my time in undergrad, I kind of struggled with the learning curve of stepping into the architectural studio, as it was so far removed from what I'd known before. Drawing boards and orthographic drawings, bending moment diagrams and the likes. I suppose in first year, while others had come from a background of maths, physics and art, the 3 staple subjects that'll lead you into architectural education, I had an A-level portfolio of art, politics and history. And while these didn't really help me too much with the bending moment diagrams and the orthographic drawings, and didn't really serve me too well in the initial stages of my education, it's perhaps a little bit ironic that they have actually played these interests have played a pretty significant part in my latter development. In university, it certainly wasn't, I mean, I'm painting a pretty poor picture there, but it certainly wasn't an all bad experience. Being in the architectural studio in Chlorine Gardens was an absolutely fantastic time. There's great camaraderie, there's great ability to bounce ideas off each other, to learn from each other, and generally fostering some sort of, I don't know, informal support group during late nights and post-crit reviews. And that sense of solidarity and sort of cohesive learning with your peers I took away from university, and actually upon finding difficulty to get a Part 1 placement in 2011, me and 2 friends entered into an international competition, and we put to test what we'd learned so far in response to a brief which sought to find sustainable technical solutions to a Finnish neighbourhood called Suvela. Our proposal was to design a civic plaza and an urban farm wherein residents would grow and cultivate willow coppice in order to feed a sustainable community heating system. And lo and behold, we did pretty well in that competition after just kind of throwing some ideas at the page, and we found ourselves flown out to Helsinki. 3 Part 1 students from West Belfast standing in a room full of international delegates discussing technical innovations in building sustainability. Funnily enough, we won the innovation prize for this project because our scheme relied heavily on community use rather than technical innovations, and with regards to sustainability, whereas we sought to foster a sense of sustainability ingrained within a community, within a dense suburban post-war neighbourhood. There's a bit of a strange feeling in being awarded the innovation prize for what we've seen as the most logical solution. As architects, we said, in terms of urban design, that this is really what you should be doing. And it's perhaps this sort of naive idealism, I suppose, that we as architects brought to the table that allowed us to win the innovation prize. So that was my Part 1 experience, and after a brief foray into Nordic urban design and an extended stint as a Part 1 student in Consark, I reconvened at Queen's University to start my master's programme, completely emboldened by a newfound confidence and appreciation for the potency of good design. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I learned through my master's and what I was able to take away from it. My master's projects essentially were very much centred around an investigation into civic urban artefacts of Belfast and how the pattern, colour and form of specific buildings affects not only the character of the buildings themselves, there's City Hospital and its massive ostentatious chimney beside it, but also how these elements, the colour, the pattern and the form actually affect the surroundings and the character of the city, character of neighbourhoods. There's Divis with St Peter's there. And also this image just kind of picks up on the autonomous nature of buildings in Belfast, particularly in High Street, where each building is its own little standalone sculpture, which is perhaps a reluctant neighbour, kind of stands and looks like a reluctant neighbour to the one standing beside it, and runs the complete gamut of architectural design from transport house modernism to the sort of national building there, which is high Baroque detailing. And there I am with my sort of thesis to build a big skyscraper in Belfast, which is going to house a prison, and was going to be very much in the vein of the likes of City Hospital and the Ashby Building, Divis, and those tall buildings that have a very specific colour and pattern to them. And you may pick up my little T-shirt that I designed as part of my thesis, picking up the details on the Ashby Building. That was part of, I mean, you might be able to tell here, I had a lot of fun in my master's, and that T-shirt element was part of what I described as the Urban Fabric Autumn Collection. So I still have a couple of those in my house. I really should sell them one day. So there I am, and there I was, 5 years of architectural education, completely all learned up in what it takes to be an architect, surely, and ready to, like a coiled spring, ready to make my mark on the world. What else could there be to know? Well, I went back to work for Consark as a Part 2 student, and I was very grateful to be able to sort of continue on projects that I'd been on in Part 1, including the very prestigious Lynn Library, the QUB Graduate School, and sort of get a very hands-on experience with the likes of restoration projects and getting up close and personal with brick details, as well as completely diverse and broad range of projects such as the restoration of the HMS Caroline, which was a fantastic project to be involved in. And during this time, while working on all these prestigious projects, I did what any good Part 2 student knows all about, and that is being up to your oxters in door schedules, window schedules, toilet schedules, room datas. And at this time, I suppose as well, I was attending meetings with clients, with contractors, largely in the background, with a really solid buffer zone between being the main sort of point of responsibility, because it was at that time that I was exposed to what I would call the encyclopedic knowledge which is required to sort of see a project through on a building site, particularly conservation projects, which have their own specific set of terms of references and idiosyncrasies. I am totally unashamed to admit that this is just a small selection of references that during that time I had to go back and Google sometimes after being on site and nodding my head profusely as people kind of said these terms are referenced, and I was saying, yep, know exactly what that is. And in my part 2 experience, I suppose the best phrase that I had learned while being on site was, I'll check that when I get back to the office. So from working on the Queen's University of HMS Caroline, it was perhaps only a matter of course for my next royal project to be on Her Majesty's Royal Residence in Northern Ireland, Hillsborough Castle. And this project was really what it was all about. My sort of architectural learning so far. I'm working at the coalface of construction projects after university. I was actually permitted to pick up my pencils and once again let loose to design a visitor experience within an area which was previously referred to as a bit of a locked away hidden gem. And this experience was a particularly interesting affair because the Hillsborough Castle project, the genesis of it was by and large a design competition at the very outset of it, where our response to a design brief formed part of the qualitative assessment for the tender process. And so kind of just fresh from qualifying, there I was as part of the team with Dawson Stelfox and Brona Lynch, the directors in our office, presenting our scheme, our proposed scheme, to the Board of Trustees of Hillsborough Castle and Historic Royal Palaces as to how I thought that they could best spend their 20 million or so budget within Northern Ireland. And there is perhaps a fair bit to be said about the naive idealism that I talked about whenever we were in Helsinki there, and having the confidence to be able to kind of say, no, this is probably the right thing to do. I'll talk a wee bit about our initial design. Our initial design really response was centered around the creation of a visitor journey, framed around a series of spaces with different characters, framed by different geometries afforded by the existing irregular pattern of the historic estate. And for anybody who's had the pleasure to go to Hillsborough Castle and the visitor centre there, essentially the project was sought to bring in visitors via what is essentially the back door far away from Hillsborough Castle itself, the horticultural estates entrance, which is shown just here, so that the onward journey, incorporates a bit of a circuitous route or a journey through the whole estate, through which this would be the gateway, which culminates in a visit to the main house, the main Hillsborough Castle. So I suppose in that last slide there, that was me drawing things on a page saying this is really how it should happen, and this is how it should work, and this is how I see it happening and see it working, this series of spaces and how you move through this site. That's all well and good, having your ideal design aspirations, and then whenever you get to the reality of designing this thing, you're going to have to contend with significant constraints, including not least the fact that the estate is listed. And it has significant built and archaeological heritage that needs to be addressed, as kind of shown in this slide. And the proposed site for the visitor centre was the location of many historic horticultural artefacts, which shows the historic use of this quadrant of the estate. Not least the 17th century hot wall, which is just shown in the background of this photograph here, behind Floss the dog. And that would have been used, this hot wall was a sort of like technical innovation in the 17th century, where it would have been used as a mechanical sort of hypocaust system, where there would have been a boiler at one end of it. The wall itself would have been hollow and would have had horizontal channels in which heat from the boiler would have heated the wall, and there would have been this lean-to conservatory on the side of it. And that would have been used to kind of cultivate exotic fruits that would not have been sort of suitably available in our Northern Ireland temperate climate. And I kind of talked about the ideal, like naive idealism there, and I suppose my naivety in conservation philosophy was kind of brought to the fore whenever I suggested or queried in one of our internal design discussions early on in the project whether we could just get rid of this hot wall because it's standing right in the middle of what I want to do, and that's something that Dawson Stelfox nearly threw me out the window for. That he wasn't best pleased with that proposal. He subsequently proceeded to kind of sit me down and explain the benefits of keeping the wall that was on the site, and the benefits of conservation in general. And there's the hot wall there itself being conserved during the construction. And this photograph shows how we incorporated the retention of the historic structure into the overall project. So I am very glad to have heeded the advice of Dawson and Brona, as this not only kind of creates a distinctive feature within the main dining space within the Hillsborough Castle Visitor Centre, but actually now represents a living and breathing heritage artifact which tells the public about the story of the estate and about those who lived in it and who kind of worked at this element of it. This was a great project as a learning curve, particularly about the building knowledge, as I kind of said about there, the knowledge of assembly and construction of buildings. There was a very specific onus put on about the delight in the detail and craftsmanship and the heritage aspects of the construction. So I pretty much was able to use this project as an opportunity to learn about how these things go together. How load-bearing king post trusses are made, where they're made, where wood is sourced from, as well as not only the timber frame, but also the likes of the bricks. I was very grateful to be able to go to Suffolk, over in England, to see Bulmer Brick and Tile Company and how they make bricks, how bricks are made. I mean, before this, I was just designing a wall and said it should be handmade brick. Really getting into the nitty-gritty of what that means. This was an excellent opportunity to kind of learn exactly about that and learn exactly how the constituent parts of the brick are made, and what it is, what it means to make a brick, and how you make bricks, and what soil you use, and what additives you use, how you get the different colours. And this place down in Suffolk, they brought us right into the kilns where they fire them and where they store them, where they pull them out of the ground, pull the clay out of the ground. There are, I think, 5 of these bricks here that we brought over to Bulmer Brick and Tile, and they were from the walled garden in Hillsborough, and we were seeking pretty much to match that. And they pretty much just did it like you would make a cake, really. Threw the ingredients in, put it into a formwork, and then they put it into the kiln. And to get the sort of multi-stocks, the way that some of the bricks were on the bottom and closer to the heat, they were overburnt. The ones that were in the middle of this pile were less burnt, and that's where you get the multi-stock colour. So for me, that was a fantastic learning experience to be a part of. And what I also learned about was that sometimes contractors don't like handmade bricks because they come out of the package like this. They refer to these as the bananas, which couldn't do much about. That was very much it was an interesting one to be part of, actually, because the contractors were pretty much saying, "Are you going to come back whenever we've done this and say that's not straight?" Because there's only so much tolerance you can have with handmade bricks, so this was part of kind of just throwing this in to kind of say that there was an element there where we knew about the handmade bricks, but you needed to really understand them in order to understand the junctions and details that we were proposing, because ultimately it's great to know about these bricks, but we're trying to create an architecture here. We're trying to create buildings that have an element of delight in them, and so that little sort of step recess is something that was sort of very important in the design process. So there's Hillsborough Castle Visitor Centre there and there. And it wasn't just about the timber trusses, and it wasn't just about the bricks. I was exposed to all manner of construction techniques and sort of construction techniques that I didn't even know were available in Northern Ireland. And this place is just outside Newry, Balnalis Forge, and they made that fantastic sign that I just showed at the start there, and the likes of the squirrels and everything else, all the parts that are on it. So in terms of learning about putting buildings together, it was a fantastic experience. And if somebody had said, and to me, James, you're doing a presentation on my architecture, if they had said this a couple of years ago when I just finished Hillsborough project, I would have said, yep, not a problem, I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. My architecture is all about the tectonics of how things go together and the construction of materials, etc. That's what I'm all about. However, there is plenty more to happen in my architectural career so far, and what's past is prologue, as Antonio says to Sebastian in The Tempest. A bit of a philosophical quandary as to the nature of what has gone before and how it influences future behaviour. Now, I will admit that this is a very tenuous link to introduce a suitably theatrical quote to a suitably theatrical project, which was the restoration of the Grand Opera House in Belfast. And that's something that I started on in 2017. And everybody kind of knows the Grand Opera House and how sort of plush and gilded and rich it is and opulent internally. But back in 2017, unfortunately, it wasn't. And as the Prince of Morocco found out, to throw in another Shakespearean reference, all that glitters perhaps is not gold, because Shiva on the walls there was laden with cracks, our jumbos and our elephants, unfortunately laden with cracks and sort of and even May McFretridge, unfortunately, was given to the depredations of time. So, and this was the condition that we kind of entered the project in as well. The fact that there was a make do and mend, or sort of ad hoc slinging things against the wall in order to contend with new technical advancements since the building was last upgraded, really in 1979. And in terms of a learning curve, in terms of things that you had to learn, this was a very steep learning curve, I suppose, this project, to restore a beloved icon of Belfast, making sure that it's equipped for 21st century use, totally reconfigured technical infrastructure, improved accessibility, improved general ambience, all while ensuring that the character of this building that I know and that you know and everybody knows is retained, and also completed with an 11-month construction period. It was a steep learning curve, but it was an incredibly enjoyable learning curve. And with the exception of perhaps knowing the soundtrack to Les Mis word for word, I'm not a theatre expert. I work in a conservation department in an architectural firm. So going into this project, I can admit now that I didn't really know a whole lot about stage lighting, about audio, about visual, about what exactly is required. But I took perhaps a little bit of solace in reading Robert McKinstry's account of his involvement in the primary restoration of the project of the Grand Opera House in 1979, where he talks about exactly the sort of things that I was sort of concerned about. How do you make an efficient, up-to-date theatre out of an existing 19th century theatre? And how do you balance this with the two distinct categories of restoration and conservation? So I'm just going to highlight this I'm not going to talk too much about the innards of the project, but I'm just going to highlight this element here, which obviously is the grand circle balcony, which was used previously, and I said, in the sort of ad hoc manner. People would have just slung, because it's a touring venue, people come in, they load up for their show, and then they leave. And unfortunately, sometimes things weren't done with the greatest of care, and the infrastructure for that, for people to sling their speakers and for their lights and for their projectors, perhaps wasn't there. And unfortunately, this balcony, got a significant amount of damage to it. So what we had to do was to introduce a structural element here behind the scenes, behind the main decorative features, and install some a structural infrastructure here, which would permit a permanent lighting rig bar in order to facilitate the conservation and future sort of conservation of this decorative plasterwork. So I suppose the point that I'm making about this was that I'm not a specialist on stage lighting, on audio or visual. I'm not a specialist on, I wasn't a specialist on fibrous plaster. But what we brought to the table was, I suppose, a bit of critical thinking in order to ensure that the heritage character of the building was maintained, while all of these things were integrated as part of a coordinated effort. And it really was a coordinated effort, not only on the design side, pre-construction, but also during the construction. Whenever we opened up and thought to ourselves, right, we need to get wires from A to B. How do we do this? And there's a significant amount of on-site involvement, in order to ensure that things, would have been very easy just to tape the wires to the wall or pin them to the wall and run conduits underneath the sort of decorative ceilings, but that wasn't the name of the game, really. And I love this photograph because this is behind all of the smoke and the mirrors of the Grand Opera House. This is the point in time which I stood there and went, right, okay, so we're actually doing this then. We're going ahead with this project. Okay, let's go. And I'm just kind of going to show this photograph. This is the photograph from 2016 or so, 2017. Before we did any works, looks fantastic, plush, gilded. Who would have thought there was any sort of problems there? And then this is a photograph from the end of our restoration. Very sort of slight changes in terms of colors, in terms of some of the textures that are used, and the fact that you can't see, there was this project involved the restoration of the auditorium as well as the restoration of the bars in what is called Act 2 in Great Victoria Street beside the Fitzwilliam. But the majority of the budget was spent in the auditorium in order to conceal all of the likes of the wires and the cables and all of the technical gubbins, all the while conserving the decorative plasterwork, the decorative ceiling, installing new seats, new carpet, new upholstery. So there's the difference between the two. Also probably better camera as well. I kind of said about the Act 2, I'll flick around this very quickly, but it wasn't so much, it was a task. The task at hand was to ensure that there was an intervention here, but it didn't look like there was a significant intervention, so that the retention of the character was there. And that's the same for the external as well. And this is what our proposal was for that extension, which was put on in 2006, which is a very deliberate departure from the aesthetic of the main Act 1 auditorium of the Grand Opera House, in terms of its materiality and in terms of its proportion, its rhythm and all of that. What we proposed was to put back something exactly like that, and there's finished photographs, which hopefully reads a lot more like a constituent part of the Grand Opera House rather than something very different. I'm just going to show this photograph of the internals, because this is what the bar now looks like in the box office. And there's a very specific point that I wanted to make about this. Great, it looks fantastic. And it all kind of came from this, which is one of Brona Lynch's sketches, which kind of said, you know, and this is very, very early on, thinking idealism, thinking this is how this area should work. And to get from this to this was not an easy task. There's a significant amount of work and a lot of people's coordination required in order to kind of not only make the thing, but just make it work as best as it can. And I suppose maybe should I talk about a learning curve whenever we're talking about the spiral stair? Don't know if that's too on the nose, but this rounds me off nicely to the Early Career Architects Forum and why the Early Career Architects Forum was set up. I'm going to talk very briefly about the two patron saints of the Early Career Architects Forum, the two patron saints of early career architects. Francis Pym, who did the extension to the Ulster Museum, who won a competition, came up with a completely bombastic idea to extend the Ulster Museum in a brutalist modernist way, rather than the neoclassical, which is on the right-hand side of that photograph. And unfortunately, did not see the project through to completion because of the difficulties of running the project, because of the difficulties of managing the project, and because of the lack of, well, I'm speculating, because of the lack of support that he was given and the general difficulty in getting the thing over the line. And the other patron saint is William Henry Lynn, who worked with Charles Lanyon on a lot of Charles Lanyon's projects. And I just love this plaque, which is in the Lynn Library, which is in the QB Graduate School, which pretty much said this is erected by friends and family of William Henry Lynn, to say that he, by and large, designed the main building, which is called the Lanyon Building, or he worked on it significantly, which is a kind of a way of saying he was a young architect and he was behind the scenes, but he was very much part of the project. So the Early Career Architects Forum was set up to address those two kind of main things, a little bit tenuous points that I'm making, but to kind of support architects in order to make sure that their creative vision, their naive idealism, which I've touched on a couple of times, is supported and allowed to flourish, but also that there's recognition of the work of early career architects. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the events that we've had so far in trying to form a bit of a culture and a bit of that sort of studio culture that I talked about in Chlorine Gardens that I had. And that I was very grateful for. And this is Fergal Murray at one of our events that we titled My First Project, in which established architects talk about what their first project was, what their learning curves were, how they kind of were able to get through the practicalities of seeing a project through. And we've also established links with the Northern Ireland Construction Group in order to kind of, really to take people out of their silos and to recognise that architects are a constituent part of the construction industry, and that the construction industry is a constituent part of shaping society. The Early Career Architects Forum, I'm just going to say about it, there's a significant element of it which is a social aspect, because a lot of the support that you get is via sort of social events and bumping into people or talking about what it is that you're working on. And although that was kind of curtailed a little bit with the likes of COVID, and we tried to keep things online as best as possible, we are very much still looking at formalizing and developing exactly that sort of informal relationships. And this is our next event, which has proved to be a pretty good series called What I'm Working On, and it is essentially exactly that. Here's 3 early career architects what are you working on? Do you want to talk about it? And they're given 10, 15 minutes or whatever to kind of say, this is what I'm working on. And everybody that I've approached so far kind of says, yeah, you're going to get the same thing from everybody, aren't you? Because we're all early career architects, and you know, we all do the same thing. You do not do the same thing at all. And I suppose one of the main parts about this is opening up avenues of discussion to seeing how other people work and to see what their workload is like and to see the interests that they have. And it's an incredible conversation to be a part of. And it's, as I say, just taking people out of their silos as much as possible and trying to form as much of a cohesive early career body for architects in order that they will flourish, because they'll be the ones designing the buildings of the future. And I think that is me. And so I just in closing, I'd just like to say that that's what I've learned through architecture. That's been my learning process so far. And I'd like to think that the Early Career Architects Forum sort of builds on that learning. And I'd just like to say, just here, thanks to everybody who's been a part of it, because it has been a learning curve, and you wouldn't get through it without the support of people in the office and without your peers. So I think that is me finished.
Thank you very much, James. That was excellent. Really, really good. And I think early career architects are not the only ones that need support and input.
Yeah.
But I think the work you're doing with the early career architects group is fantastic, because I think when you get further on in your career, you realize that support is there and can be drawn on. But at your early stage, sometimes you think you're expected to do it all, and it's just not possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for that presentation, and also for your work in the Early Career Architects group. And any opportunity, I think this is a good opportunity to draw people's attention to the group. And even if there are people in your practice or working with you who would be candidates for this, do point them in the direction of the Early Career Architects group.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end, and we're actually on time, which is great. Kieran, before we go, is there anything else you want to?
Just in case anybody wanted to quiz James and see what but it was only just if anybody had any sort of questions on the tip of their tongue.
Any real low-ball, easy questions, that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's Paul.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you want a really nice lunch in a really brilliant space, go to Hillsborough Castle Visitor Centre. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So there you go, lovely day out. Bring the family, bring the kids, and you can sit and look at James's hot wall when you're there. It's because I remember sitting there and going, that wall's there for a reason. That's there for a reason, and now I know what the reason is. So very good, very good.
Any other questions for James? If not, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for attending. It's very good. So until the next general meeting, if there's anything you want to raise, don't hesitate to contact Kieran or Emmett or Greg or myself or Paul. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
All the best, everyone.
Thanks
very much, James.
Bye. Cheers. Bye.
Yeah.